let's finish the discussion of scale insects and now move into the soft scales. So, what I'm calling soft scales are two families, and this is probably not technically correct. The family Coccidae are the true soft scales. Areococcidae are sometimes called the felt scales, but both of both of them have quite similar habits. So let's kind of see how these insects develop in contrast to, say, the armored scales we just went through. This is the cottony maple scale, of large scale, mostly large because it produces a very large egg sac that's made of wax, and eggs are laid into it, and eggs hatch. However, in the wintertime, when season is dormant, you will find soft scale like this in a much smaller form. Looks like just like a little bump on the bark of a twig. This is the female who has not yet become has not become mature, so she's quite small. Will resume feeding in the spring when the plants renew growth, and as she becomes full grown as a fully grown adult, she will then start to produce her eggs. And in the case of this insect, the eggs are laid into an egg sac, and this egg sac is made of wax, and she'll lay eggs in it. A few days later, those eggs will hatch. She'll be laying more eggs. A few days later, those will hatch. Lay hundreds of eggs, perhaps close to 1,000 or more eggs in the course of her lifetime. So quite a large, very conspicuous insect, the cottony maple scale, an insect, by the way, which feeds on a great many hosts other than maple, such as the honey locust that's illustrated on here. Eggs hatch, and this insect will then move to the leaves in the summer. So the form that's present after the crawler period is a nymph that's on the leaves. Mobility is retained; it still has its legs, so it will be there on the leaves all summer, and then late summer starts the migration back to the overwintering sites, which will be on the twigs, and there they settle and last through the winter. A difference between soft and armored scales is whether they'll produce honeydew or not, and that is a function of where they feed. The soft scales are feeding on the phloem, and the phloem feeders will produce honeydew. So we see little honeydew droplets here excreted by soft brown scale, a scale that's quite common on houseplants in our area. And the soft scales, along with the aphids, are the big two honeydew producing families of insects that we have in the northern half of the United States. If you get into warmer areas, that's whitefly and mealybug country. So scales and aphids tend to be replaced more by more kinds of whiteflies and mealybugs. In the northern areas where we have cold winters, those two groups of insects are quite rare and rarely will be able to survive outside if there are freezing winter conditions. And of course, where you have a honeydew producer, no matter what kind it is, if honeydew lands on a leaf and persists for a while, you'll see the sooty mold growing, and it may grow on the branches and trunks and limbs as well as on the leaves. It all depends on where that honeydew has landed. Another example of a soft scale, in this case striped pine scale, a fairly common insect on pines in much of the United States. In the wintertime, again, it's not a fully developed female. They're quite small, very inconspicuous, in this case, tucked around the base of the needles. In spring, when plants resume growth, the females resume growth and they will swell. And they're swelling with eggs. As eggs are maturing, that's largely what will make up their body mass at this time. In the picture on the lower right, I think you can also see it looks a little shiny, and that, of course, is the honeydew. Eggs will be produced over a period of several weeks. Eggs will hatch over a period of several weeks, and you'll have crawlers for a period of several weeks. And they will be moving about the plant, mostly settling at the base of needles, and that's where you'll find them again going into the next year. The males with this species will move to the needles themselves, and the males have a different form than the females. They're much more elongate. Next year, Females resume development, swell to the size that they get that you usually see them imaged as. And at this time, again, they're producing eggs, and eggs are hatching to produce crawlers. And then one last example, the felt scale, but very similar in other respects to soft scales. This European elm scale is the key pest of American elm here in this part of the country, where we have quite a few of American elms. Dutch elm disease is relatively easy to manage in areas where the tree is not native in the western U.S. and the Canadian provinces, the prairie provinces. But elm scale is a terrible problem. Anyway, in the fall, again, it's on the branches, on the twigs and branches. So in this picture, you see lots of partially developed females, all within the crust of the sooty mold that's on this bark, the bark of this tree. In spring, those insects will resume development and they will swell greatly and become mature perhaps in very late spring, starting to produce eggs. Eggs are hatching, produce more eggs are hatching, and we see crawlers. These little yellow objects in these two pictures are crawlers. And here are crawlers in motion. There should be European elm scale crawlers. Again, tiny, very tiny, much smaller than the mother. Crawlers move to the leaves. In the summertime, you find them on the leaves, just like with the cottony maple scale example. Again, also tucked near the main veins, something I should have pointed out before. That's a very common site where they'll be, because it's a little protected there. They're feeding on the leaves. They're producing honeydew incidental to this feeding, and a lot of sticky goo coming out of the trees at this time. Where it lands, of course, sooty molds will grow. And these pictures of elms I've been showing are largely blackened from sooty mold growing on the honeydew of European elm scale. Another thing we'll see in this insect and some other scale insects, a similar kind of effect would be what we call scale flagging, where branches that have heavy load of scale are stressed and will prematurely yellow and often prematurely lose the leaves. This can sometimes make it a bit confusing when you're doing scouting for Dutch elm disease, because you also look for yellow flagging. But in Dutch elm disease, the leaves will usually collapse and wilt. In this case, they stay intact, but they turn yellow and drop prematurely. And then in the fall, they're back on the twigs. They leave the leaves, move to the twigs where they'll spend the winter. So this would be a picture perhaps taken in late August. So we see some important differences between these two kinds of scales. The soft scales producing honeydew, and that's related to their feeding site. The armored scales do not produce honeydew. Again, the armored scales are feeding on individual cells, soft scales feeding on the fluids of the phloem. Soft scales can produce hundreds of eggs, and the armored scales are producing typically a couple of dozen eggs at most. So we're seeing an order of magnitude difference at least between these two groups. There's differences in mobility, where the soft scales, they retain mobility. They do not lose their legs after the first stage, the crawler stage. So you can see them moving to the leaves and then later moving to the branches and twigs. Whereas an armored scale, after it hatches from the egg and is a crawler, will only be mobile during that period. And after that time, when they settle and have molted, they lose their legs and remain in place for the rest of their life. And the period of crawlers is going to be quite different between these two. And in the case of soft scales, as they mature, usually in spring, they are going to be producing eggs and young over a period of several weeks, so we get crawlers for a period of several weeks. Armored scales tend to have crawler periods that are more defined, so the crawlers may all hatch during a fairly short period from the eggs that were the overwintering stage in many cases. So crawler period is much more extended as a general rule with a soft scale than with an armored scale. So what do we do about scale control? A couple of things I want to kind of go through some cultural controls and some chemical controls for the most part. Uh, Scraping scales, physically scraping scales, has some applications with some types of scales. They can flick right off, or if they get on the bark or limbs, this is probably where it's most appropriate, say a obscure scale or oyster shell scale in this case. And if you just scrape the scales off, if they're a living stage, they will probably be damaged and certainly cannot get back on the plant. And if you dislodge the eggs, if that's the stage that's underneath that scale cover, then the eggs will readily dry out. So just scrape them off using a little scrubby here. It doesn't need to be a belt sander or anything. You don't want to hurt the bark. Just easily flick right off. They'd flick off with your fingernail. But a lot of scale control centers on going after the crawlers. These crawlers are not only the primary mobile stage and the only mobile stage for an armored scale, but it's also a highly vulnerable stage. They are not armored up, and a wide variety of insecticides can be highly effective in controlling crawlers. Uh, Whereas after the insect has developed a thicker scale cover, they become much more difficult to control. So we go after the crawlers, and it depends on what kind of insecticide we're considering as to when we might apply these. So if you have an insecticide that has long residual activity, meaning a product that if you applied it, it would continue to kill crawlers for weeks, then you might consider applying it when the crawler period starts, and then it will be in place and perhaps can kill them for 4 to 6 weeks later. If you have an insecticide that does not have any residual effects, a soap or an oil, these are best applied at the peak period of crawler activity. So here's those little crawlers, highly vulnerable, and again, almost anything will be able to effectively kill a crawler. So how do we figure out when the crawler period is? Often uh, state recommendations of locally important scales will give general information on when the crawler period is and use that as the guideline. Crawler period, of course, can vary year to year at a location due to weather. Warmer seasons will be a little earlier and cooler the reverse. Also, if it's rainy weather, scales will usually not emerge from eggs and will remain hunkered down under the old mother scale until wet, inclement weather passes. But we can monitor them, and one way to monitor them, fairly simple, would be using double-sided sticky tape. You put it on the plant, and young crawlers are pretty feeble insects, and they will get stuck on a piece of double-sided sticky tape, as indicated in these photos here from California. And you might consider changing the tape. It doesn't need to be clear sticky tape. It could be black tape. It could be white tape. You might want to vary it if the color of the scale is different. These scale crawlers are going to be very tiny and difficult to see. So if you have a kind of tape color that allows them to be well contrasted, then that might make it easier for you to do this monitoring. And you maybe flag the branches so you can find it again, and then check it a couple, 3 times a week, starting a week or two before you expect them to emerge, based on what you've learned about the scale in your region. And that can get you a good handle on when they are out and for how long they are out. Now, you don't need to know specific products. I'm just trying to make a point here with this slide is there's a lot of products that we have that are used to control scales that have residual activity that could kill scales over a period of weeks. Many of the pyrethroids, carbaryl 7, and some of the systemic insecticides in the neonicotinoid class like dinotefuran and acetamiprid. But one thing to consider with scales and other insects too, but for scales it can be quite important, is that you should consider treatments or treatment timings that conserve the natural enemies, because there are often an enormous number of things that are eating scales. And there are insecticides and insecticide applications that could be made that will devastate these. And there are other kinds of insecticides and applications that could be conservative. So ideally, you would want to use a treatment that conserve them. So not only do you get the benefit of the treatment you're making, but you retain the benefit of the natural enemies rather than squandering them with an insecticide that would kill them. And so, again, the products that I listed just a bit earlier, these are some of the more common scale crawler treatments we have at this point in time that's used in tree shrub care. Not all of these are products that are available retail. Many of these are commercial products. But if we look at the ones that have uh, long residual activity and also are conservative natural enemies, we have a very short list. Only one on that list, a product called pyriproxyfen, I would say is a selective scale treatment that will have little impact. And it is a kind of insecticide in what we call the insect growth regulator class. It acts on the way that certain insects molt, and specifically, it works on insects like aphids, soft scales, whiteflies. For the most part, that's its main market. So it's a quite selective type of product, and it's the one that I recommend here in Colorado for tree care folks if they have a situation where it is important to be conserving the natural enemies. So it takes out the scale, conserves most of the rest. Anyway, products like this would be the ideal for many situations where we have a selective product. And then horticultural oils and insecticidal soaps can be used quite selectively in terms of conserving natural enemies, but neither of these have any residual effect, meaning they will only be capable of killing an insect that you spray at the time of application. If an insect walks across an oil or soap treated surface an hour later, they're not going to be killed. So in this case, you want to time your treatments a little more precisely, and that would be at peak period of crawlers. And again, this could be determined by using the double-sided sticky tape kind of monitoring. Now, of these two products, soaps and oils against young scales, is one better than the other? And one of the projects I've given you for this class, or as an optional thing you can do in this module, is I've given you a paper on this subject, and the paper suggests that the oils perhaps are better used on an armored scale, and the soaps are better used on soft scales, and perhaps the difference it would be in the nature of the scale cover, because they are chemically different. What covers a soft scale versus an armored scale. Anyway, I suggest you read that article if you've got interest in this. It is optional, but I've made it available, and see what you think for yourself. In most cases, though, I think that oils are going to be a quite useful product, and they have multiple times of application. So historically, oils were originally used in the dormant season, because originally we had oils that could only be used in the dormant season on plants because they would fry the leaves. So we'd have what we call dormant oils. And that was a pretty standard kind of scale treatment for a long time, and remains. However, we also have options to treat at different times of the year now, because the kinds of oils that we have on the market today are much more refined and improved than what we had, say, 40, 50 years ago. People have learned what needs to be in an oil to kill an insect and what is in an oil that hurts plants. And they have been refined to take out the impurities that are phytotoxic, can cause plant injury. So these kind of products could be used against a crawler, but they could also be used after the crawlers have settled and they're still quite small, at least with these armored scales. So in this picture here on the upper left are oyster shell scales crawling. So that's going to last a couple of weeks, but maybe you just wait until they've all done. They're pretty much all done, and then they'll look as they do in the picture on the lower left. They recently settled, still not highly armored, and oils could pick them up at that time. As for systemic insecticides, mostly we're talking soil applications. There are some trunk spray applications, but soil applications are the primary way we go after these. And whether they're going to work, it depends on what kind of scale insect we're talking about. So the systemic insecticides we generally have are imidacloprid. That's the most widely available one. That's the one we have as a retail product in many parts of the country. And that is primarily effective against phloem feeding soft scales and not armored scales. So again, this imidacloprid product, I talked about it several times. The reason we see it working on one group versus the other is feeding site. The soft scales feed on the fluids of the phloem, and the systemic insecticide will move in adequate amounts in those fluids, so a phloem feeding insect will be killed by it or can be killed by it. Whereas the armored scales don't feed that way. They're feeding on individual cells, and this is not a highly mobile product in the regards to moving within the cells. So there's very little of the insecticide in the individual cells. So you get a soft scale and an armored scale on a plant, and imidacloprid would pick up the soft scale and likely largely leave the armored scale untouched. In this case, the striped pine scale being the soft scale, well controlled, and the pine needle scale being an armored scale, not controlled. But there is a systemic insecticide that does have some activity against armored scales. It's the other one, the dinotefuran, and that's because it has properties that allow it to be more broadly mobile in the plant, and so it can move to the site where an armored scale would feed as well as a soft scale. So these would be retail and commercial formulations of dinotefuran. And the reason for this, and again, we went through this back in the very first section, the first class, the intro class, but it is a product that is much more water soluble than the other systemic insecticides that we have. So dinotefuran is on the right, and also chemically is much less likely to bind to organic matter, something that's indicated by what we call a KOC value. So these two properties make that product able to move more broadly within the plant, including to the sites where an armored scale feeds. So that could be used for armored scales, and as we mentioned before, it can also be used as a trunk spray. This is the product when we talk about emerald ash borer, could be used applied to the trunk because it can move in through those bark fissures. And if you can apply a treatment to a trunk, in the case of a scale insect that's maybe feeding on the leaves, that can have advantages too, because that could be a fairly selective method of application. Even though the product on the trunk would kill natural enemies, most of the natural enemies would be on the foliage, so they would not have the exposure. So there could be a more selective type of application. Anyway, these are the general principles of scale insect control. Targeting crawlers can be highly effective, and products with some residual effects are often most effective. Products that conserve natural enemies is usually a more sustainable process for getting good scale control. So if they're both have good residual and or conservative natural enemies, that could be a nice mix. Horticultural oils pop in several places. They can be used in the dormant season. They could be used in crawlers. They could be used in recently settled crawlers. And the kind of performance you might expect from a systemic insecticide depends on what product you're talking about and what kind of scale you have. So that winds up scales. And then we'll move on to spider mites next.